Good afternoon, and thank you for joining our webinar today. My name is Eric Kinman from the LSI Marzano Center, and I'm your host for today's webinar. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar called Creating Conditions for SEL and Rigor in Your Classroom with Dr. Robert Marzano and Amy Dujon.
Well,
our webinar today, I think we've got a little technical issue here. Amy, can you share your screen?
I am sharing my screen. Hold on. Can you see it now?
There we are.
Okay.
All right. Our webinar today is scheduled for about 45 minutes, and we'll have time for questions at the end. Before we start, I have a few helpful reminders for today's webinar. First, your audio lines are muted during the presentation due to the size of the audience. However, we welcome your questions and comments. Second, you may do so by using the GoToWebinar question pane located on your screen. I do want to call your attention to the handouts that are associated with this webinar. We have 4 of them, and they're free for you to use. Finally, today's webinar will be recorded, and a link will be distributed to you via email. Feel free to share the presentation with colleagues who are unable to attend. With that, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Amy Dujon is practice leader at LSI and the author of 2 new books, The Gritty Truth of School Transformation, 8 Phases of Growth to Instructional Rigor, and The Essential Flipbook for Achieving Rigor. Dr. Robert Marzano is Executive Director for the LSI Marzano Center. He's a nationally recognized education researcher, speaker, trainer, and author of more than 50 books and 200 articles on topics such as equity, instruction, assessment, writing, and implementing standards, cognition, effective leadership, and school intervention. So without further delay, I'll turn it over to Amy and Robert.
Amy, I'll go first and say where I'm coming from. So thanks for that. Those kind words. I appreciate it. My name is Bob Marzano. I'm coming to you from sunny Denver, Colorado, which is actually 70 degrees right now, but will be 40 as a high tomorrow. Amy, how about yourself?
So I am in beautiful, sunny Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. So where it is 70 and 80s year round. But we did get a little cool snap this weekend, which was really nice.
Well, this I'll take the lead in the beginning. This webinar is focused on SEL and rigor in the classroom, although we're going to spend the majority of our time on the SEL part and try to relate that to rigor. As you might guess from our introductions, I'll be talking more from the research and theory side, and it's that application of both of those to the classroom. And Amy will give us a grounding in what actually just happens in schools. In other words, after I present, Amy will correct me and give you the correct approach to and Amy and I have known each other for quite a long time. And,
yes.
So it's a good combination here, these 2 perspectives. So let's just jump in.
Let's do it.
Okay. Now, as you might or might not know, we're coming from the perspective of a model we have at the Marzano Center, and that's the center for, we have the model for the essentials for rigor. And Amy, why don't you put all the pieces and parts there?
Sure. So one of the pieces here, and when we're trying to develop the standards-based classroom, is we really adhere to this teaching map. And so what we've done is really condense, taken Dr. Marzano's framework and really put it into a flow, into a map that really is easy for teachers to follow, easier for school administrators as they're engaging in PLCs with their teachers to develop lessons, to work on infusing some of these SEL practices that we're going to talk about today, as well as meeting the grade level expectations and standards. And so the pieces of the teaching map look like this. We start with standards-based planning. And I think one of the things that's been a huge shift for leaders and for teachers, and it will continue to be a shift, is that standards-based planning, that planning time is so sacred. We've got to get more teachers engaged in some collaborative planning and really help them see that their heavy lift in creating these rigorous environments where social emotional learning is being developed, it happens in that planning. So during the planning, we look at those criteria for success. We're identifying the learning targets and planning formative assessment. We're tracking students' progress, but we're also talking about the how of instruction, right? How are we going to get kids to produce at the level of the standard and of the target? And so we need these instructional strategies, these research-based strategies to be the vehicle to create tasks for students to do that. Where the conditions really come in is that if these conditions are not in place, students aren't able to engage in that collaborative work, right? They need the structures and the guidance to do that so that they feel that they are valued in the classroom, that they feel that, you know, they have an equal say when they're working with their peers. And so we develop these engagement strategies and these, what I like to call the rules of engagement within the classroom, so that every student can be successful. And so that the final piece of that then is that as we're creating those tasks around those instructional strategies, we're gathering that data so that it informs our instruction as we move forward. And so this whole picture kind of makes up that the teaching map that we use when, especially when I was at the school. This is what we sat down in PLCs, and we really use this as our driver as we were planning units and lessons for students at every grade level.
Let's go to the next one.
Sure. So let's talk about the how.
I'll jump in here. Now, given our dual focus in this webinar on Rigor and SEL, let me show you where they fit. And I said we're going to not focus on Rigor that much in this webinar. But look at the instruction side there. If you look at the bottom 4 strategies, that's where Rigor is most commonly focused on and enhanced, helping students examine similarities and differences, help them examine their reasoning, helping students revise knowledge and engage in cognitively complex tasks. Now, let me give you a little preview to a book that we're just finishing off called Understanding Rigor in the Classroom. Those strategies like these have been around for a long time, and in general, they work pretty well. But if you want to get to rigor, you have to make sure certain things occur within strategies like this. First of all, what is rigor? Now, if you look up rigor or just Google rigor in schools, you'll see many different explanations of what rigor is. Here's how we define it. Rigor comes from activities that help students identify new distinctions in information they're either receiving for the first time or have initially been introduced to. So new distinctions. And actually, to bring this down to a practical level, anytime you engage in one of these 4 activities, those 4 at the bottom, or other similar activities, if you make sure that you ask students to kind of summarize what they learned at the end of that activity, special emphasis on is there anything they now know that they were inaccurate about before? Okay, that's one piece of it. Is there anything that they're going to add to what they used to know? And is there anything that has been reinforced about what they know? So those are the 3 kind of perspectives on rigor. Either you're adding something to what you thought previously knew about the topic, you're finding out you were wrong about something you thought you knew about the previous topic, or you're reinforcing, you're saying, oh, I was right about that. I would assert if you had that simple little tag-on activity or questioning technique, if you will, a little review activity with students, that would up the rigor, up the ante in terms of the ability of that activity to actually enhance, the rigor of students' learning. Amy, you want to comment on that?
I do. One of the things that I've done with my teachers and that I've seen that we've coached in other schools is something simple as just having the question stem up there for them to respond to. I used to think, and now I know. So, I mean, we could go back to the whole idea of a KWL chart, things like that, that actually get to that point. But when kids are reflecting on learning and they're going back and they're saying, I used to think this, but now I know, and they're adding, just like you said, the new nuggets that they've learned either from their peers or from their research and their reading, or they're revising their thinking because they've gotten a more in-depth context. That's something that I've seen be very successful at all age levels across school buildings. So it's a very easy implementable strategy to use at the end of your lessons or the end of a task. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Donna Ogle, she was at National University. I think Donna's retired now. Over 30 years ago, came up with the KWL strategy. It's interesting,
Yeah.
It's simple, yet it works so darn well. And in those days, we didn't even talk about rigor. The conversation around rigor was more around critical thinking, which bottom line is almost synonymous with how we use rigor right now. So that little addition helps a lot. And on the other side of it, I've seen activities in the classroom where students are examining similarities and differences, and it really doesn't do much to enhance rigor at all. So these things just in and of themselves, they're just danger here in just saying, oh, there's a list of activities, so let me do activity A, and now I've addressed rigor. No, it takes a little bit more. There has to be that self-reflection part guided by the teacher. Now let me go to the conditions. Conditions, you can look at those as psychological conditions that are necessary, or context for learning. And this is where the social emotional learning most logically comes in. But let me talk about social emotional learning in general for a second here. That term means many, many different things to many people. Please realize that. And also it has a long history. Actually, the best report I've seen to date on kind of the breadth of what social emotional learning can mean in a school is from the Wallace Foundation, or is funded by the Wallace Foundation. It's called Navigating SEL from the Inside Out. It's a free document. It's long, it's technical, but it's really very powerful. I'll say it again: Navigating SEL from the Inside Out. Recommend it highly. It's very thick, and like I say, they go into depth in about 25 different programs, but they also give a really good perspective on, gee, this has been around for a long time, it being SEL, and it's meant many different things. So there was a time when we talked about 21st century learning skills, and that was in the 20th century we were doing that. And if you look at those, a lot of those are very similar, to what we call SEL skills. The Whole Child Initiative, and ASCD's got a really big push on the Whole Child Initiative. It's great stuff. But if you look at that and you say, my gosh, that's a lot of what we call SEL skills. You can go all the way back to emotional intelligence, or EQ. Right. I don't know if you remember that. That was Goldman's very famous book. And Castle, the organization in Chicago, great organization. Actually started with a kind of a emotional intelligence perspective, and now has expanded that to address very specific SEL skills. Lifelong learning, has been talked about for decades. Mindfulness is a very popular topic now, even metacognitive skills. So there's been a lot of discussion of these skills, for years, but kind of been, for a different, talked about in different ways. Amy, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because if you look across each one of those organizations or each one of those theories, it all kind of boils down to the same thing, right? Creating environments for students and adults where they feel like they belong, where they feel like they're valued, and where they feel academically and emotionally safe, right? And so it's giving children and giving adults those structures so that they can engage and have and feel that sense of belonging.
Now, we always like to come from a really strong theoretical and research perspective. Yes. And so that's what we're going to give you today. In 45 minutes, we can't go into a lot of skills, but I think we'll give you hopefully very useful perspective on this. As you know, in the Essentials for Rigor framework, we actually have a book that's focused on creating conditions for rigorous learning. And in that, you'll see things that, you've seen for a long time. They're just, we think, organized. They're organized in a certain way that maybe provides some insights you might not have had before. So you'll see things like establishing rules and procedures, recognizing adherence and lack of adherence to rules and procedures, engaging students, establishing and maintaining relationships, having high expectations for all students. Now, let me put this in more of a theoretical framework here in terms of how SEL fits into this and how SEL, kind of has different, means different things depending on how you look at infusing rigor into your curriculum. So let's take a look at the next slide.
Sure.
I think one type of approach that people use quite a bit right now is what I call the crosswalk, so crosswalk approaches. And here's what that means. That's when you look at, instructional strategies, and, we just gave you categories for instructional strategies that we call the conditions for learning. And let's say you're using that framework. A crosswalk approach is when you take these new terms, these new skills, competencies, thanks very much, that you want to teach, and you plug them in to those different things that you do in the classroom. Actually, in that book that I mentioned, we talk about teaching cognitive skills.
Mm-hmm.
Take a look at that. And actually, cognitive skills is the more technical term for what we call SEL skills. Cognitive skills are both cognitive, but they're also emotional in nature. They're very much oriented to understanding of the self. So that's more the technical term there. Now, you'll recognize these as very common in lists of SEL skills: becoming aware of the power of interpretation, cultivating a growth mindset, resiliency, avoiding negative thinking, interacting responsibly, handling controversy and conflict. And there are many lists. That's not the right list. It is one list. But let me show you what a crosswalk approach would look like. So crosswalk approach, let's look at our model of conditions for learning. And that would be a crosswalk approach. And there's really nothing wrong with that. So if you're doing that, kudos to you. So we've taken the areas that we have, in our conditions book. And look, we just, put in things like, using formative assessment to track progress, you could probably reinforce grit or persistence there, self-efficacy, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one way of doing it. It's kind of straightforward. I don't think it's the most powerful way, but it's definitely useful. Now, to get at a more comprehensive or cohesive approach, I think you have to come from a theory base that makes at least two distinctions. So let's go to the next slide there. And here, for me, these are two big pieces or two big ways of approaching social emotional learning. One is activities that enhance the social and emotional context for learning versus actually teaching social and emotional skills and awarenesses. And we're going to go over both. The first one is the easiest to do, and that is easy doesn't mean it's not powerful. It's very, very powerful. The second one takes a little more thinking and a little more, selection on your part as to what you put into there. Amy, you want to comment on this this kind of two-part scheme here?
Right. So I think what you said was really correct, and that the activities, usually we can think of as we're sitting in our teacher teams and we're building tasks for kids. It's easy for us to look and say, okay, well, how can I make this an activity where we can really build those social emotional skills and competencies, where I can get them to take varied perspectives, and so we can plan questions and tasks that way. But actually teaching kids to have self-awareness, right? Or what self-awareness actually is, or to become self-aware, or teaching them how to interact with each other respectfully, or to take those very perspectives. That, there's a lot of dynamics that go into that because of the fact that you're dealing with diverse individuals that are all coming to the table with different things. So it is quite easier, I would say, to design an activity than it is to really teach each and every child what does this look like in your context and from your perspective, to have that awareness and those skills and to develop those, because they need they need some side-by-side coaching.
Okay, so I said, well, I'd like to come from a research and theory perspective.
Yep.
Let me start creating that, at least the one we come from.
Sure.
Go to the next slide there. Notice the human condition label there, and that's really true. What we've tried to do is say, wait a minute, social emotional learning is really a lot about knowing how human beings operate, we as human beings. and what do we do well? What don't we do so well? Do we have to watch out for? And here's a basic principle that's pretty easy to accept. Human beings all have needs and goals, and that is so foundational. I mean, if you just keep that in your hip pocket, that every human being all the time, every second of every day is probably operating from the perspective of needs and goals that they have. So we need a framework for needs and goals, and we've taken a pretty common one, as the one we're going to use. You'll recognize this as coming from Abraham Maslow's great work way back in the 50s. He talked about 6 levels of goals and needs. At the bottom there, at the top, the first ones are more needs. The ones down at the bottom are more goals. And this has kind of an intuitive appeal. Now, you might use another model, but we say start with the notion of, wait a minute, students in our classes, what are their needs and what are their goals, and how can we frame these? And this still works really well, and it's kind of intuitive. We have physiological needs. And so metaphorically, you can say that at any moment in time, students are asking themselves, am I physically comfortable here? And if they're not, most of the time they are, but if they're not, that gets in the way of learning. It really does. And so what do schools do, to address that? Well, they make sure that the classroom is comfortable from a physiological perspective. Let's go a little more complex here. Am I safe here? And there's 2 types of safety we're talking about. One is physical safety, and the other is psychological safety. And so you can always assume that students are thinking about their safety. And you say, well, gee, in most classrooms and most days, they're physically safe. They're not worried about that, but there's a psychological safety too, and that would be relative to their peers, what people think about them, et cetera, et cetera. Now, even though students might actually be physically safe, from harm, that doesn't mean they think they're physically safe. You can make a case that, with everything that's happened, going way back to Columbine in 1999. And by the way, as I speak here, I'm not that far away from Columbine. That day is seared in my mind. My wife's a really good psychotherapist, and she was not a first responder, but she was more like a second responder. She worked with teachers and parents and students in Columbine after the fact. And you can make a case that the incidents like that in Sandy Hook in Parkland and have just place the fear in students' minds that boy, I might not be safe here today. Going up a little bit, belonging. We all have a need for belonging. Do I feel like I belong here? And if students don't feel like they belong, then that's going to get in the way of learning. You see, the whole idea here is that if a need or goal is not being met, we turn our attention to try to get those met as best we can in a given situation. Higher up on his scale, Maslow's scale, do I have a sense of status here? That gets to our need for a sense of esteem. Now, when you get beyond that, you're more into goals. Next level of self-actualization. And Maslow said that every human being, we're just born with this. Self-actualization of Maslow, I'm paraphrasing here and not doing a good job of it, but he basically said that that's when we're doing things that make us feel like we're becoming more of who we are. And that's a huge construct right there. And in schools, I mean, that would boil down to, gee, am I getting to work on things that are personally relevant to me here? And then he said at the highest level, and Maslow actually put this in later on in life after he had created the model. And he says that's connection to something greater than self. He talked about this is transcendent in nature, that when we're operating from a sense that we're doing something bigger than ourselves, it kind of transcends our current experience. In other words, I'm sure you've all experienced this. You might be doing something that's very difficult and might be physiologically uncomfortable, and you kind of feel out of place, and but still you're doing something good for other people. It transcends the moment. Now, I would assert that good teachers, let me state that differently. The teachers who are the most effective, even though they might not be able to articulate this hierarchy, are actually working at all of these levels throughout the year. sometimes whether they know it or not, it's just kind of there. And that's why it's one of the major reasons why they have such powerful results with their students, both academically and also not academically, non-cognitive areas. Amy, just curious about your reactions to that.
No, I think that as we work our way up those, and we're moving from amongst each layer, and if we connect it back to that idea of building rigor, and we're looking at those strategies that we're using in classroom, I can speak from my own experience that as students begin to feel they belong, as they're interacting with their peers responsibly, and they're building that respect and taking those varied perspectives, and they feel that psychological safety to do that, what you see students who typically will disengage, or who will be quiet, who will withdraw within the classroom, begin to elevate. And then those who tend to be your high flyers, they really get inspired by being able to help others, right? And so it becomes not only about my goal, but our goal as a group, as we're working together towards something, as we're trying to accomplish something. How can we all be a part of that? And I saw that time and time again in classrooms, and it was truly inspiring to me as a leader, right? It drove my work, because I could see that what we were doing was impacting kids and their results. So I think that as we look at Maslow's, and as we're talking about the model, just those basic things are in place, then teachers are so innovative that they will find ways to get kids to connect to those goals, and to make their classrooms as responsive as possible, so that every kid feels like there's something in there for them.
Okay, so remember, we're in the section here we're calling activities that address the social emotional context of teaching. So what does that look like? A lot of this will be very familiar. Here's what it looks like. It means that the school as a whole, classroom teachers individually and the school as a whole, make sure that they are doing things that address these needs and goals that students have. And the good news is, I think we're doing a good job in a number of areas here. But it should be in the name of social emotional learning, but taking the side of, let's make sure we hit the social emotional context of the students' needs and goals. Well, let's go through those 6 areas and make sure we're doing things that are overt, they're planned for, they're explicit. So activities that address physiological needs. This will look familiar. You periodically assess the needs of students relative to hunger, sleep, mental health, physical health, homelessness, and unfortunately, all of those, have what we see more and more is students with real problems in this area. There are students who come to school, hungry every day, sleep deprived. My wife mentioned a really great psychotherapist, and she would say, you'd be surprised, the just mental health issues that you'll find in the classroom. And that's not a statement on any type of students or any grade level. She would just say that, in general, people struggle with mental health. And she defines mental health as having addressed, issues from the past, which is a goal we maybe never completely reach. I mean, being a human being is a struggle in a sense to, reach a state where you really feel as satisfied and comfortable and happy as you possibly can be in a given day. Physical health, homelessness, unfortunately, that's becoming more and more a problem in many, many cities. And then obviously employ the appropriate available resources and services as needed. The good news is there are a lot of services available to educators at the school level and classroom level. The bad news is we often don't know about those and therefore can't access them. Anyway, I think this is fairly well handled. At least it's on the radar of pretty much every teacher I've talked to in every school that I've been involved with. Let's go up a level.
Yes.
Safety. Activities that address safety needs. Now, obviously with school shootings and stuff, there are things that are now being implemented, to some people call it hardened schools. There's good and bad, aspects of that, but anything that we can do to make schools more safe, the better. So I think I'm going to skip those things. Notice the first bullet there is to reach out to parents, to provide them with the awareness of students. need for a sense of physical and psychological safety at home. And I don't mean this in a critical way of parents. I'm a parent of 4 and a grandparent of 6. It's hard being a parent, as I'm sure many of you know, like myself. Just the more information, the better. I think you might be surprised how hungry parents are from just some good ideas here, and some strategies to handle maybe problems that they have at home. So just create that connection with parents, so parents feel like the school's in partnership with them to make their children feel as safe as possible. And then the second bullet really deals with comprehensive school plans and classroom plans for safety. And unfortunately, more and more we become aware of that. Amy, you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I'll say, as a former building leader, and then also having been with a few superintendents this last week, that the second bullet there, although I feel like we are making huge strides there, that is obviously a safe environment is the number one priority on all of our lists, but that practicing those safety procedures and doing it on a regular basis, so that everybody feels comfortable. It's not like, oh yeah, what did we do back in the beginning of the year when we ran this drill? Practicing those procedures and having that as an ongoing thing is really important, not only for your teachers, but for your students. And your parents are your biggest advocate. I found that when we provide them with strategies, parent academies that you can do on campus with them to help give them tips for coaching their students through homework, tips for coaching their students when traumatic events happen nearby, ways to get their kids to talk to them about those things. And that's what parents really, really are looking for, because they're not armed with those tools and those resources. So when we as the school can reach out and provide those to them, it's really a win-win for all of us. Okay,
let's move to the next one. Now remember, we're talking about the school doing things to address the social emotional context. Okay, we haven't got to the part yet where how do you teach students about social emotional learning, or teach them social emotional skills. Again, I would assert, if you don't do this first, you're probably not going to have much success on the teaching of social emotional strategies. I mean, just think about it. Go to physiological comfort. That's one of the things you talk about, making as a skill of social emotional learning would be to know that we have those needs, and our physical comfort is a function of our sleep. It's a function of our health. So one skill, if you will, of being a human being who's socially, emotionally balanced is to address those things. You have to get enough sleep, I have to get enough food, et cetera, et cetera. But if they're in an environment where that's not provided, teaching the skill isn't going to help much at all. It's interesting, there's a gentleman from India that physician by trade, but now he's moved over into the education world, and he's setting up a curriculum for rural schools in India, which deals with just this, and that is understanding about basic health needs.
Right.
But he always emphasizes, it's crazy to teach those things, in environments where they don't get those needs met at school and at home. So let's do belonging here. And I think we tend to do a good job with belonging by and large. I think that's on the radar of most teachers and most schools. Examine the extent to which the schools and classrooms are have an inviting atmosphere. And I believe this is Stuart Perky's work years ago, where he talked about the fact that, we do things unwittingly that students, perceive as inviting, and we do some things that they perceive as disinviting. And a very simple strategy is to ask students, classroom and school level, gee, what are some things that we do or I do that make you feel you're welcome here? What are some things that we do or I do that make you feel unwelcome here? And just addressing those, very simple. Assess the need for interventions for specific students relative to bullying. I think we do a good job on that. Also utilizing strategies that contribute to a respectful learning environment. Boy, that's a hot topic right now. And I won't get in my soapbox about how the poor examples from, you know, the nightly news in terms of being respectful with one another. Anyway, I'll get off that. Not being partisan either. I think, you know, we can all get a little bit better. Utilize strategies to produce an environment of affection and cooperation. And I think these are strategies that are on people's radar. We do a pretty decent job. Let's do the next one there.
Sure.
Very similar. Esteem, a level up, but still kind of in the same category. Belonging means that I feel like, okay, I'm welcome in this classroom. I'm welcome in this school. That's a little bit different from, do I have a sense of esteem? I might be welcomed by my peers in the class, but that doesn't mean that I perceive myself as having a certain status, you know, within that peer group that I kind of associate myself with. You know, what you'll see in pretty much all of these suggestions here is that focus on growth. Let students see that they're growing. You know, they're getting better at whatever it is. That creates esteem with human beings. See, we're wired as human beings, I would assert, in such a way that as long as we see ourselves getting better, we feel good about ourselves. I always use the example of when I was first learning how to ski. My wife was an excellent skier. I was an adult, obviously, and she was excellent. And I realized that I could never get as good as she. However, when I took lessons and found myself getting a little bit better, I felt good about skiing. So even though, you know, I was never going to reach her in terms of her skill, the fact that I was getting better helped me. I felt good about myself. I really had a sense of esteem relative to myself in skiing. So things to do. Emphasize and celebrate student academic growth as opposed to status only. Now, if you know our model, Essentials for Rigor model, we talk about standards-based planning, and that means having performance scales and measuring growth based on that. Acknowledge and celebrate students' accomplishment outside of schools, and identify the things that they do in music or painting or skateboarding or whatever it is, just anything, you know, and constantly, you know, recognize that and celebrate that. Allow students to set personal goals and celebrate their accomplishments. And those can be goals that are academic, but also goals that are non-academic. Now, Amy, I've seen your school when you were principal. I know you did a lot of this. You want to comment on this?
I will. I'll tell you, one of the things that I love is when students would set their own academic goal, when they would say, you know what, I'm going to work this week on, and they were able to reflect on where they were. They knew exactly where they were in relation to achieving, you know, a target or a certain academic goal, and they drilled down enough to be able to say, this is what I've got to get next. And it was so empowering for them. And then to see their peers rally around them and celebrate it, even though they were all in different places, that was really exciting, whether it was ringing the bell or taking a minute within the classroom, you know, to be able to stand up and say, hey, I did this, or even within their table group of peers. I was in a school not too long ago where at the end of the, like the 9 weeks or the trimester, the elementary students in this school, it was actually K-8, were able to write down, instead of the teacher giving out awards for, you know, the best reading achievement or the gains in math or whatever it was, students wrote down actually what they were proud of academically that they had accomplished. They got to personalize that and then bring those awards home. And so I saw a student who said, you know, I'm really proud of how my writing has how I've grown as a writer, and my writing is improving, and I'm including more details. And so it's those types of accomplishments and celebrations that really help to build this esteem within the classroom.
Okay, let's go on to the next two levels here. Now we're more into the goals. Remember, Maslow, you know, would assert that these are all hardwired human needs, but we're going to call them needs and goals. Activities address self-actualization. Now remember, this is when people are doing things that make them feel like they're becoming more of who they are. So one very concrete recommendation we have is each year have students engage in personal projects. Now you can teach metacognitive skills in the context of this. And these projects would be of their own design and choosing, and very commonly they wouldn't be academic. So if you were doing this, I mentioned I have 6 grandchildren. My oldest grandson is 10, and if he's in public school, and his goal would have something to do with soccer. He wants to be, the next Neymar. If you're a soccer fan, you know who that is, the greatest soccer player in the world. So that's a nice dream. Well, it goes up a level from a dream when you actually start working on it. So, a personal project for him, he would want to make a certain team in his league as his personal project. And we leave this wide open. Also, periodically have students examine and develop their images of their possible selves. And that might be a funny term, but years ago, a great psychologist named Hazel Marcus developed a theory where she talked about future possible selves. And it wasn't just a theory. She did a lot of really powerful research. Basically, she said that, very successful people at a very early age have a vision of their possible selves, what they can be in the future. And that guides them, through life. It really does. Now, unfortunately, everybody, and she would say everybody, has those dreams of what they could possibly be. But unfortunately, if you grow up in an environment where you don't see that you have a lot of resources, those dreams tend to be ratcheted down. You say, well, I'd love to be, a great physician, but I'm not going to be able to go to college. And we kind of mute those goals that we have. So there are many activities just about enhancing the notion of what could you possibly be? What would you do? Actually, one of the greatest strategies I saw for encouraging this was around personal projects, where teachers started by saying, okay, let's swing out. What would you do if you knew you wouldn't fail? Even though we do fail, human beings do, but if you knew you wouldn't fail, what would you try to do? Now, you're talking about motivation at kind of that, intrinsic level. They're shooting for something they would really, really like to do. Let's do the last area, and I want to have Amy's comment last two, and that is connection to something greater than self. And it's just what it sounds like. Basically, you can, talk about inspiration relative to this. Some people say that we're at this level, we're inspired. Life is, remember, it's transcendent. We've gone around beyond just thinking about ourselves, even though it's important to think about ourselves. Provide opportunities for students to engage in altruistic projects. At least once per month, expose students to inspirational stories or speakers. Well, if I were a king for the day, I would say every school in this country would do that second bullet. Stories, just information, people who've done exciting and amazing things from all walks of life. An exciting thing doesn't have to be making a lot of money or being a sports hero. Something exciting, that a person did just, for their own family or just themselves. They accomplished something so powerful. At least once every 2 weeks, present students with inspirational quotations. I think we underutilize quotations. Great coaches have used these for years. If you're a basketball fan, the name Tom Wooden. And he was a great coach, and he used quotes all the time. And then anecdotes, having teachers actually provide anecdotes about inspirational experiences they have had. Now, Amy, I know both of these are areas that you're personally interested in and incorporating in the schools. Why don't you comment?
Oh, absolutely. And I think when we give kids the opportunities, especially I love the inspirational quotes. That's something that I use frequently, even as a leader, and allowing them to internalize and interpret that, and have them kind of take it and say, okay, so what does that mean for me in a personal project I'm working on, or what does that mean to me as in relation to how I'm developing relationships with others, or how I'm functioning as a member of our classroom community. So I think that there's so many great resources out there where they can find, where you can just get your hands on some quotes of the day or a quote of the week and put it out there and say, okay, as we work through this week, I want us to keep this quote in mind and see how it changes what we do in the classroom and how we reach our goals.
Okay, let's jump to the other side. And you think, well, boy, we're not going to have much time for that. And your answer is right, but we want to give you kind of the ultimate social emotional learning skill, if you will. And hopefully, if we do a good job, you'll see how virtually all of the others kind of fit into that. You can take the growth mindset, and you can take resiliency, and perseverance, and all kind of fits in. But again, we'll have to start with a theory base here. So let's go to another part of the human condition. First of all, remember these, those needs, okay? But let's go back to this little graphic here. So let me add to that theory of the world. Now, this is something we don't necessarily teach students, although it's not bad to teach them. We have to have, grounding in as we design social emotional learning strategies. So let me add a little bit. Notice the thing that says theory of the world. That's a simple way of saying that most psychologists believe that, as human beings, we create our version of how the world works. We have a theory of how the world works. And remember those 6 levels of Maslow, we really, these are our beliefs. We really have beliefs around that. I mean, let's go down to the lowest level of Maslow's hierarchy, and that is physiological comfort. We have a theory about what is beliefs about what is comfort and what is something that's not comfortable. No kidding. You can just take people who grow up with a great deal of means and resources and money. Their beliefs about what is comfortable are different from a person who grows up without all of those resources, and they would have a very different set of beliefs about what's comfortable and not comfortable. Same thing, different beliefs about what safety represents, what is safe and what's not safe, all the way up to the top. And that's not a bad thing or it's not a good thing. It's just the way it is. So each of us live within our theories of the world, and those grow over time. Now, we have our needs and our goals. We're still going to stay with Maslow here. And in any given situation, at any time, we're usually operating from some, from a basic perspective of those needs and goals. Notice the term scripts. Okay, now, that's actually a term that's been in the field of artificial intelligence for years and years and years. And artificial intelligence is the field of science where we try to get machines to mimic human thought, and we're doing a pretty good job of it. Surprisingly so. If you look at artificial intelligence, if you read that stuff, the things that machines can do, it actually gets a little bit scary. And the way the machines can do that is the programmers that actually have created scripts around really thousands, maybe millions of situations that human beings are in. Let me explain what a script is. It's what we've learned to do in certain situations. So the easiest one is think about what you do when you get up in the morning. Okay, well, you've got a certain script, certain routine equals script. You do this first and this timing, et cetera, and we don't even think about it. But really, that deals, with, our human need to, well, first of all, we have jobs, we have to get to work, and so we have scripts that make sure we accomplish those goals. Now, for the most part, we just go along our merry way and, we're executing the script to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. And right now, I'm trying to accomplish talking about this particular topic. And so I'm using my script called giving a webinar. And I'll keep doing that until something interrupts that. Okay? And that's where interpretation comes into play. So let's take a teacher. A teacher making a presentation to students will be executing his or her knowledge information presentation script. Everything's fine and dandy until something interrupts that, or could possibly interrupt it. The teacher sees in the back of the room 3 or 4 students talking and giggling. Now that's where interpretation comes in. We immediately make an interpretation based on our beliefs about what that event means. And see, if we interpret that as a threat to one of our needs, so I'm a teacher and I have a need for esteem in this building, and I interpret this as disrespect on the part of the students, I will execute a new script. I will have a reaction. That's a new script. I will, if I think this is a disruption and it's critical of me, it's disrespectful of me, I will execute my stamp out the disrespect script. And if I interpret it as well, it's just they might even be talking about what I said, and actually having some insights into the content. I will react very differently. I will continue with my script. Now, that's the basis, if you will, for all of those skills that we want to teach students. Let's take the growth mindset. Now, this is not to impugn Carolyn Dweck's fine work. It's spectacular teaching what she's presented to us about the growth mindset. But can you see what the growth mindset really is, what it tells us? Growth mindset has something to do with our theory of the world. You're really addressing the beliefs of students, and that's the power of the notion of the growth mindset. The whole basis, of Dweck's work is to say, just to teach students, hey, there are a couple of perspectives one can take, relative to accomplishing a task. If the task is difficult, you either take the perspective of, hey, I can do that because I have the talent for it, and if that's the case, and we don't think we have the talent, then we don't think we can do it. That's the fixed mindset, as you know. The growth mindset is one that says, wait a minute, my belief shouldn't be about I have the talent or not. My belief should really focus more on how hard I'm willing to work relative to this. So that at its core, and if I can train myself that, wait a minute, I run across a difficult task, then if I can just remember, it's not whether you have talent or not that's the most important. It's whether or not you're willing to work hard. Now, there's the breakthrough right there, and that's the essence of the skill or strategy of the growth mindset. Hope you can see the same thing with things like perseverance. That's really a matter of beliefs. It really is. That if I believe, hey, that working hard over long periods of time will pay off, then I will tend to do so. But without that change in your theory of the world, without your change at the belief level, you're probably not going to persevere. So I would assert that pretty much everything most of the things we talk about in terms of social emotional learning skills are a function of their theory of the world. It's just a basic understanding of how human beings operate. This is simplistic, but it actually works pretty well. We've got a bunch of beliefs up there. We operate from needs and goals, and we're usually operating at any moment in time from the perspective of making sure needs and goals are met. And we've got scripts that we operate. Something changes, I have an interpretation, and those are based on my beliefs. And I will react, then I will have a reaction / a new script that comes from my interpretation. What really gets kind of scary is when you realize that our beliefs are sometimes handed down from us to us, how we grew up. I grew up my father was a career naval man, and we moved all over. My mom says I was in 13 different schools. I don't remember that, but I was in a bunch of them, and therefore certain beliefs were handed down from me, from my parents and the environment that I grew up in. So the backdrop for social emotional learning skills, I would assert, is really the theory of the world, in dealing with beliefs. Amy, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, when I read your book that you and Jana wrote together, I mean, it really came home to me as a school leader trying to change core instruction, right? So we were rewriting our scripts, and one of the things that really was compelling to me as I talked to students at various grade levels was I would ask them, tell me about what is school? Tell me about what happens when you go to school, or what is a lesson? And they have this script, right? Kids have scripts already, even as early as kindergarten, of what teaching and learning looks like and sounds like. And so when a teacher deviates from that script and does something different, it takes them a minute to acclimate, to make those interpretations on, is it okay to do things this way that's different than a way that I expected, or the way that I've done it before in the past, and what is the outcome going to be if I do engage or I don't engage. And so we have to give teachers and students space to kind of do that interpretation and then react and create that new script, which can be messy sometimes. I think it's important to note.
Okay, so let's go back to that list of cognitive skills,
Sure.
Which is another name for saying social emotional learning skills. So I hope you can see that virtually every one of these have a component that deals with something I just showed you relative to that human condition. Beliefs, for the most part. Becoming aware of the power of interpretation, was an overt part of that. We actually do interpret everything that comes into our consciousness, and that interpretation is a personal thing. And sometimes it's accurate, and a lot of times it's not accurate. The growth mindset I already mentioned, resiliency I already mentioned, avoiding negative thinking. I didn't have time to go into that, but you get the idea. Handling controversy and conflict. Conflict comes from interpretations of what people
Right.
are saying or doing. And if we interpret what they're saying or doing as a challenge to us, and it might be that it is a challenge to us, but once we do that, we then increase the probability of us executing a negative script, and when you execute a negative script, probably nothing good's going to happen as a result of this. So for me, the ultimate social emotional learning skill is on this next slide. It's a little strategy that you start with, and then everything else. I'm saying we do teach resiliency, the growth mindset, et cetera, et cetera. But you also might think about teaching this in some way, shape, or form. Any situation that this could be a person who comes into our consciousness, a situation, an activity, a task that we have. If you notice yourself reacting strongly negatively, I should say, and that's either fear or anger, you're probably in trouble right there. They say, what's my interpretation? And then what am I going to do about it? So I'm the teacher. I see the kids giggling in the back of the room, my interpretation of being disrespectful. What am I going to do about it? Really, you're asking, what script am I about to execute? And then will this have a positive long-term consequence? And I've think about it, so wait a minute, if I go and really get on these kids, if I call attention to it, that's probably going to escalate things. So if not, now I don't want it to escalate, that doesn't have a good long-term consequence. What should I do differently? Well, instead of confronting them right up front, I'll just do it kind of indirectly, just ask them to pay attention. And there are strategies where you can diffuse that situation. So this foundational knowledge of the human condition, our needs and goals, in that progression of events. Something new comes in, I make an interpretation. If it's negative, I react to it and I execute a new script. That then will form the basis for everything else, the vast majority of the SEL skills, like resiliency, like grit, like persistence, that we see. And stated differently, I think if you just teach those as isolated, they have an effect, but not as powerful and long-lasting and all-inclusive as they could have if you also teach this notion of the basic human condition and kind of basic the way human beings tend to operate. And that's part of our hard wiring. Amy, you want to comment on that?
No, I think it's very powerful when we look at these 4 questions, and the fact that this isn't something in that moment as I'm a teacher and something's happening and I'm about to react. These are things that I ask myself really quickly, right? Remembering that my reactions are going to then cause the execution of a script on the recipient's behalf, right? So I have to think through these 4 questions relatively quickly and make that decision of how can I react in a way or execute a script that's going to have the most positive long-term outlook. And so, I find these to be just this one slide right here is so invaluable that as a teacher, as an administrator, I would print this and put it somewhere, close to me that I could carry with me, until it became my script in my head for reacting to things, right? Just to remind myself to ask those questions.
Okay, so let me go back. Here's what we've done. Said SEL's been around for a long time under different names. I'm glad it's very prominent right now. That's good. You should look at the history of SEL just to get a feel for where it's come. We believe that there's kind of 2 basic approaches. That first of all, coming from a theory base that all human beings have needs and goals, and that really is what SEL is about. How we interact with the environment relative to those needs and goals. One big category of things to do is activities that will address the basic SEL context, that students live in the classroom. And then the other is what are the strategies that we can teach students. For each one of those 6 levels, that there are strategies you can come up with to actually teach students. But the big strategy is this, and that is teaching students about, hey, we have our own theories of the world, we make interpretations, we have scripts, things that we automatically do based on our interpretations. And sometimes they work well and sometimes they get us into trouble. Okay, we didn't leave much time for questions, did we?
Well, I think we can turn, Eric, if you want to jump in here, if there's some questions that we can handle from the audience, we'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So we'll take some time to hear questions and comments about today's webinar. Please submit your questions using the GoToWebinar question pane located on your screen. We have a couple of questions already coming in, of course, with this good-sized audience. First, I do want to make a note that this slide presentation, recorded version of this webinar will be distributed to you via email tomorrow morning, so look for that. Couple of other questions here. Examples, excuse me, Dr. Marzano, could you give more examples on the activities that enhance the sense of belonging?
Oh, well, belonging, substitute the word welcome. What are the things teachers can do? What are the things a school can do that make students feel like they belong? I mentioned a big category. There was Perky's work where he talked about schools doing things that are inviting to students versus disinviting. And that really is, you ask the students. This little survey, what do we do that are inviting? What do we do that's disinviting? Other than, I mean, this really deals with relationships. All those things that teachers do to establish good relationships. Make sure you know students' names, know something about them. Make sure you talk to all students. Maybe kid with them a little bit. Amy, you want to add to that?
A great technique that is really hitting across a lot of schools is things like a morning meeting or a right at the beginning of a class period, taking a minute to just check in with each other, not necessarily about content or about academics, but just as individuals, where we sit around, either in elementary, we go to the carpet, we sit in a circle, we have a brief meeting, what's something, we can react to something we've seen, a picture, or it might be something, a story that's been told, which we talked about earlier, where somebody tells a story, of an inspirational story, and then we react to that and we connect it to ourselves. So, utilizing things like that might only take, 5 to 10 minutes, but getting kids to engage, to open up, to begin to talk about themselves is really what helps to make them belong. Standing at your door, welcoming them as they come into the classroom, making notes of, oh, I really like your shoes, or, hey, I noticed, you've got a bright smile on today. I love seeing that smile. I can't wait to see it in class, as we start the day. So, it's stuff like that that gets them connected to you and to the classroom and to their peers.
They actually just, if some of you know Rachel's Challenge, I've become very good friends with them. And Rachel's Challenge is a program they call 180 Connections. It takes about 5 minutes in the morning, 180 days. And at the beginning of the day, you start with students pair up, or they're in dyads or triads. And it's a little question that the teacher asks to share, like, what was the first, the pet you like the most? I mean, you might think that's innocuous. When you have 180 questions like that, and students throughout the year are interacting with every other student in class, by the end of the year, they really know a lot about each other.
Yes.
So just things like that. There's a lot of them out there. Anyway, 180 Connections, you might look it up.
Great, thanks to both of you. Okay, another question. How do you shift the mindset of staff members who are more consumed with their evaluations and find it difficult to understand the importance of SEL?
Oh, good. Well, I would, you want to do that, Amy? Want me to?
You go ahead and I'll jump in after you.
Okay. Well, see, I think that whole notion of let's just take that hierarchy, that the level we're operating from dictates how we interpret everything. Remember, if you're just jump right to the top there. If you're dealing with a connection to something greater than self, now you see the world of the classroom and the school differently. You see, worrying about evaluations, and I don't mean to demean that. That's important stuff. It really is. But when we perseverate about that, it kind of drags us down to, wait a minute, what's my score, et cetera, et cetera. If we can, in general, keep the view of, wait a minute, what am I doing here? What am I doing in this classroom? And am I engaged in something that's bigger than me? And the answer by definition is yes. If you're a teacher in a school, you're changing the lives of other kids. So when you set your sights, make yourself more continually aware of that, That's the highest level of human motivation, of human operation, some would say. I think that helps. I really do. And then obviously solve the problems of evaluation. That could be a 2-day conversation. I don't think the way we do evaluation is the best way to do it. My recommendation, if you know my work, is to use evaluation more as teacher development as opposed to teacher measurement. But that's a whole other conversation. Amy, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I also just believe, honestly, as school leaders, we have to embody those SEL competencies, and we have to cultivate them within or with the adults in the building. And sometimes it's really easy for us to say to the teachers, okay, we need to infuse SEL into the classroom, and we neglect to start first with ourselves. And so it's providing an academic community for your teachers where they feel safe to take risks, where they're not looking at every time you come into the classroom as, oh, now they're in here to evaluate me. And so a lot of that comes with just like frequency and visibility and being in the classroom to celebrate some of those things that we talked about outside of evaluation, so that those things are just kind of happenstance of what happens throughout the year. It's something that does take place, but it's not the only time somebody's engaging in the work with me. It's not the only time that that I'm able to really feel their presence and to feel like I belong and to feel like I'm valued and that I have the esteem I need in the classroom. So I would challenge us as leaders to begin to cultivate those same levels within our teachers.
Now, if you look at Maslow's 5th level of self-actualization, imagine if you start the school year and the evaluation cycle with what would make you feel, like you're really growing as an educator?
Right.
We do. How can I help you at that? And by definition, that gets the emphasis. Remember, people forget about growth much more than status. And just imagine starting off the whole cycle with that. What can I do? What can we, the school, do to help you get better? Where would you like to get better? Good.
And I think that's some of the biggest growth I saw was when I actually stopped and took time to talk to the teachers and say, how does my feedback actually help you to grow? Does it? What do you need from me to help help make you better? Because that's my job, right? And so when we open those dialogues up, then they begin to express to us, here's what I need from you when you come into my classroom. And that's the best experience once that happens.
Good. Do you have, either of you have any suggestions for integrating SEL strategies in an asynchronous, fully online environment?
Yeah, I think there's so much out there that's online. See, that's where you get into the specific, for example, growth mindset, persistence, resiliency. You could create that a curriculum for that. You really could. Each one of those areas you could define in terms of student awarenesses and behaviors. The first part of teaching strategies or skills to that end would be give them information about that. And there are schools that do that. So first of all, you have to come up with a list of what are the SEL skills you want to teach. What are they? What are the skills? What are the steps of those skills? And see, they're processes. Every process, though, you have to have information first before you can actually utilize the process, and create some change in your life, or create something the process was designed to create.
Good. Do either of you have thoughts on data walls where all teacher names and student data is on a wall to compare with others?
I do. I've seen that done well. I've seen it not done so well. For me, that's a goal, to get to a place to have an environment in the school where you're so transparent, about what's working and what's not working, that you're comfortable doing that. But if you start, I've seen it done kind of in punitive, is the wrong term, kind of as if you just start off with that, you have to create the atmosphere that basically says, okay, we're all growing here. This is tough stuff. Example I always give was a middle school principal. This was years ago. Who in his school, his motto was, if you work here, leave your ego at the door. And the explanation underlying that was, wait a minute, this is really tough being a classroom teacher. This is really tough being an administrator. And we're all learning. We're all going to be good at certain things and not so good at others. And therefore, let's all set goals. You start there. Let's all set goals and try to accomplish those goals. Eventually, you get to the place where it's okay to demonstrate those goals. It's okay to make those, to make those public. But that takes a while to get to where that type of transparency actually is a benefit, as opposed to something that scares the heck out of people.
Right. All about creating the conditions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay, I think that that does it for today's webinar. A couple of closing notes, if you want to advance the slide there, Amy.
Sure.
This, the Essentials for Achieving Rigor, is part of a book series, and Dr. Marzano referenced the latest book, Creating the Conditions for a Rigorous Learning Environment, which was published earlier this year. These books are also tied to professional development that's available from the LSI Marzano Center. This professional development, specifically called Conditions for Learning, this professional development outlines the strategies that Dr. Marzano and Amy Dujon outlined today. And participants in this professional development will learn to construct and plan to implement strategies necessary to design a learning environment that provides a foundation for achieving rigor, encourages social and emotional learning, and enhances instruction. So more information on this book series, as well as the series of professional development and the handouts for today's webinar and a recording of the webinar, will all be included on in an email to you tomorrow morning. With that, we will close the webinar, and I thank you all for attending. And thank you, Dr. Marzano, and thank you, Amy.
Thank you, folks.